Hello and welcome to this webinar on reducing your ransomware attack surface. A couple of housekeeping notes before we begin. All of the attendees have been muted, so if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A panel. If you're having any audio or visual issues and you'd like to let us know, put that in the chat panel. And this session is being recorded, so we will be sending a recording out after the event is over. Our speaker today is Stefan Voss, who is the Vice President of Product Management here at Enable, focused on Cove data protection. Stefan has a number of years of experience specifically in this area, as prior to joining Enable, he was the Chief Product Owner of a $500 million data protection portfolio at Dell. He led the team that originally invented EMC's cyber recovery solution and brought it to a point of over 1,500 enterprise customers in 2 years. He's got quite the great pedigree and a lot of depth of knowledge in this, and we're happy to have him here at Enable. So with that, I will hand it off. Oh, one last point. After the presentation, there will be a short demo available of Cove data protection. So if you're interested in seeing that, please do stay on. So with that, I'll hand it over to Stefan.
Thanks, Carrie, and hi, everybody. And yeah, it's a pleasure, and really, it's been a lot of fun being here at Enable. And you know, the threat of ransomware attacks is real. And what we're going to kind of focus on a little bit in this discussion is how do we recover from it, or how do we increase our ability to recover from a destructive cyber attack? That's really been also sort of the demand on data protection. You know, when I worked at EMC, and it just hasn't stopped. It's kind of the #1 concern. By the way, you can use chat. Carrie already mentioned that this is being recorded, but certainly make use of chat. Put your questions in there. Carrie will read them out. We'll make it as interactive as possible. So without further ado, I like doing these infographics. I mean, they're, you know, like, feel free to take a screenshot, I guess, and tweet away. But I think that these look very similar depending on which report you look at. And there are different sources, and I kind of put them in the notes that are not visible here. But if you're curious, we're happy to share that. But it kind of talks a little bit about sort of this whole continuum and how all these pieces are connected, right? Because, you know, oftentimes 80%, so first of all, most of the destructive cyber attacks that we worry about recovering from are financially motivated, right? There's this Verizon data breach report, but other sources will tell you the same thing. The problem is the sophistication of these ransomware attacks and these financially motivated attacks has gone up, right? You can get ransomware as a service on the dark net. And a lot of the payloads, a lot of these exploits are being donated, if you will, by nation state actors, right? So it's less of a concern these days that, hey, am I going to get attacked by a nation state? That would definitely be bad news. But the thing is, if there are a lot of criminals out there, they're financially motivated, and they now have more and more of those tools that nation states used to have. When you kind of look at the life of a ransomware attack, what typically happens is you get some kind of business email compromise. This doesn't have to be an email. It could also be a job board or something where someone in the organization clicks on the wrong link, right? And then the payload is now in the network. And oftentimes this time between this initial breach and then let's say a destruction of data, corruption, encryption, whatever it is, the difference between the two is often referred to as the dwell time. I use it for reconnaissance. I steal passwords and whatnot. But you know, this initial business email compromise, if you look at the number on the left, has gone crazy, especially with more and more people working from home. You know, the device proliferation, different tools we're using, amplified by COVID. I just think it's sort of an amplification of what was already there. And what you need to know is that there's a correlation between a ransomware attack and business email compromise. In fact, sort of a 80% overlap. If you look at sort of SecureWorks as an example, they do some nice reports periodically, so go to their sites. And it's not surprising that, you know, almost 40% of organizations are affected by ransomware. But, you know, those are the cases we know about. Oftentimes, Companies will not advertise, right? So I think almost every company had some instance of a ransomware, but decided not to publish it. But the point is, the number is going up, but what's really concerning is that the sophistication is going up, right? So 11 seconds, every 11 seconds, another interesting stat, just on the sheer cadence of these attacks, right? And then what we need to know is that the ransomware attack, when I talk about sort of the sophistication, is what they typically end up doing is they'll go after the foundation services. So if I can take out your Active Directory as an example, corrupt that, then it's going to be really hard to run any application that sits on top of it, right? So you don't have to be as sophisticated as taking out your SAP HANA instance, but if I can just take out your foundation, that's going to be a problem. Right? And then the other part that ransomware, or these criminals and ransomware payloads have specialized on, is actually taking out your ability to recover. So more and more of these ransomware attacks not only will take sort of a look at, can I take out the domain controller or something like that, but can I also destroy the recovery or the backup application and the backup copies? In other words, that local storage where all the backups are stored. And the reason why that makes logical sense is because if I can take out your ability to do business, as well as your ability to recover, then obviously it's going to be more likely for me as a criminal to extort money, right? That's basically the idea. Now, you know, there's some crazy numbers in terms of ransomware demands. I guess I don't even know if this is the highest number anymore, but 40 million. If you think about that, that's insane. The average is much lower, right? But the problem is, while it may be your last line of defense to pay the ransom, many times, and in fact, most of the time, if you believe the top right, bad actors will go back to the well. They'll come back and corrupt again because they were able to extort money before. Why trust a criminal not to come back and try to do it again, right? So it will behoove any one of us to really think about our overall security posture, which includes recovery, and having a resilience in that recovery infrastructure will go a long way to avoid having to pay and pay again, right? That's sort of the narrative, problem statement. You know, when we kind of think about what keeps us up at night, right? Some of you will be as MSPs, IT pro, but think of it this way. When you think of recovery, what is the type of disaster or use case for recovery that keeps you up at night, or you build your services around, right? That's kind of a poll we just wanted to take here real quick, and then share the results. Yeah,
let's go ahead and start the poll. And if you would give us your thoughts on this, and you can select up to 2 in case you have more than one thing that's top of mind. And we just want to be able to discuss this a little bit, find out what's on your minds. So we'll just give it a few more minutes here. And Stefan, aren't these some questions that we also asked of some of our top partners at a recent event that we had?
That's exactly right. So we like to do these, you know, PAGs, so partner advisory groups, and of course we try to hit the road, right? It's nice that we can travel and actually talk to our partners and customers directly, and we kind of ask the same questions because it impacts actually the product roadmap. And as a product manager, I of course love to understand, what do we need to design? Is it something that's more in a direction of help me recover from a ransomware attack? Or help me recover from a natural disaster? Typically, the underlying technology is the same, but the architectures can be different. Some of the product attributes can be different, but yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, well, now we've got our results. Looks like cyber attack is on 90% of your minds, which makes total sense. It very much aligns with what Stefan's been saying. And then recovery from human error, logical corruption looks like, oh no, I'm sorry, hardware failure and human error are neck and neck. And it's interesting, I think that natural disaster is actually the smallest concern these days. It used to be the number 1.
Yeah, it's completely consistent with what we see every event we go to. So thank you, first of all, for that. Thanks for playing. We're going to have more polls, right, to try to keep it interactive. But it's a very consistent picture. Now, that's not to say that natural disasters have gone away. Obviously, that is something that we struggle with more often than not. But what I also see, and this is certainly something I've experienced at EMC, is that we already have a pretty robust infrastructure related to recovering from a natural disaster, site-to-site replication, and so forth, right? And what happened when I started sort of at that cyber recovery gig at EMC is, the Sony attack actually brought that to the forefront. Our customers were asking us, well, that's great. I have a topology that allows me to recover from a natural disaster, but that doesn't really help me from a cyber attack perspective. So how do we augment that architecture to make it work for a cyber attack? So that could be what's going on here. So it's not to insinuate that natural disasters are no longer a thing. They are, but I think more of the architectural principles are directed at, cyber. How do I recover from a ransomware attack? And, I think we'll always have logical corruption, hardware failure. That's kind of your quick restore, instant access type capabilities. Okay, cool. So let's take a little bit of a step back. I just talked about sort of left of breach, or you might hear these terms, left of boom, right of boom. It's just sort of to reflect that security is not just, hey, I buy an EDR solution and I'm good, because what happens if the bad actors get in, compromise your network, and then you can't recover, right? So whether you use the NIST continuum or other security frameworks, it typically goes all the way from prevention to detection to recovery, right? And that's kind of the picture you're seeing here at a very high level. And the challenge is just keeping the stuff out. So that business email compromise, as an example, is that the perimeter is disappearing. It's, you can't really just think about, I got this wall around my organization and I'm just going to put sort of a firewall and I'm good to go, right? So lack of disappearing perimeter means lack of visibility. Everybody has a cloud first, sometimes a cloud only strategy. We have proliferation of IoT and mobile devices. So now you have more points of exposure. Everyone's working from home, and guess what? We have the same or fewer people specialized in understanding what's going on, right, in that perimeter. Really, really difficult problem. So, I think what we can do there is just, be adaptive. So when we look at the vendor landscape, make sure that whoever we partner with from an EDR perspective, we have a framework that factors in this ever-changing threat landscape and the tools and the exploits and so forth. And I believe with SentinelOne, N-able has a fabulous product to do so. But it's also important that we as MSPs have the skills and start specializing in making sense of what gets exposed in tools like that, right? And so that will help contain and help sort of have fewer things come onto the network where it then dwells, where people do reconnaissance. But the point is, we have to assume that recovery needs to be part of the picture. And recovery really is not, hey, I can do an instant restore, or I can do a failover, fail back, and then I'm done. When we talk about recovery from a cyber attack, we really need to do this in the context of an incident response, right? So that's going to require some coordination, which is different, right? Logical corruption, hardware failure. I, as the IT owner, the CIO, I can do that recovery. As an admin, IT admin, not a problem. But I can't really just restore something back into production, not knowing that it's not going to reinfect my network or contaminate the crime scene. So the coordination with security folks is going to be important, and it's not always very good. So this is where the part about technology is great, but it's also important to have a framework, some bit of process, but really practice these drills, these recovery drills, have a run book, do some tabletop exercises. Will be very important, rather than resting on our laurels. Oh yeah, I can recover, so life's good. It's probably going to work in the case of a cyber attack, right? So just some call outs here. Now, as we think about disasters, right? What Gary already mentioned, there's different types of disasters, and they typically drive different architectural principles and requirements, right? That doesn't mean that the underlying technology, the data movement, the source target aren't the same, but the way we design it, we have to think about it sometimes a bit different. Just a few call outs, you're all going to get these slides, but traditional disaster, the way we were conditioned to think, and I come from EMC, so it was these big iron, big boxes, fail over, fail back, ideally instant, never missable. So my trading application in Wall Street keeps going, and it was regional. So I needed another data center, right, outside of New York, and then maybe a third one, and they're highly connected, and it was a bulk fail over, fail back scenario, right, with as close to zero recovery time and recovery point objectives that I can meet and that I can mainly afford. With a cyber attack, the problem is, this zero RPO and zero RTO business is not very pragmatic. I have this infrastructure, but the problem is the payload proliferates across all these copies, right? Because it's highly connected. The other thing is, it doesn't help me if I have a data center in another location, because malware just sprawls through the network as long as it's connected. It doesn't matter, it can be anywhere in the world, right? So the disaster is not contained regionally, like a weather-related event. And then lastly, the recovery is a little bit different. It's often more iterative, but it's more targeted. Hey, can you help me restore this Active Directory and put it on this different target over here? It's a sandbox. I need to run some tests before I then restore it back into production. So the recovery is a little bit different. And therefore, most of the customers I dealt with at Dell and conversations here reveal the same thing as from a cyber attack. Since it's the last line of defense, I'm okay to concede on the recovery time and the recovery objective a little bit, as long as I can get the data back and as long as I have a copy to restore, which is why isolation is so important. Make sure that the attack surface for this prized restore infrastructure is as small as possible, because if I don't have that, it doesn't matter. I don't have any RTO because I don't have a copy to restore. So you can see some of those overarching principles, coordination, we mentioned that, and then some of the flexibility we might need in the restore itself. Now, before we move on, this is more of a sort of a design question, right? Because there's always trade-offs in product. We can just have two boxes and they are where they are, and I fail over, fail back, and you'll get the benefit of speed, but you're going to concede on flexibility, right? So the question here is really about what capability would be most exciting for you. Do you want instant access, or do you want more automation so you have the flexibility to restore in a location that works for you? So that's what this question's about, and we'll just let it run a little bit.
Let's go ahead and launch the poll here and make sure that we get all of your information. This is the nice thing about having the head of product management on this webinar, is you get direct input to the person that's helping guide our roadmap, that's really guiding our roadmap. And so again, this is select up to 2 options here, so you can choose more than one if you have more than one that's really important to you. But these are, different options. We just want to know what's the most valuable to you and to your practice. Kind of outlines a lot of the things that Stefan was just talking about.
And by the way, we know they're all important. It's
That's
kind
right.
of to tease out those areas that you feel are most valuable relative to the other ones, right?
That's right. Yeah, not that any of them are unimportant, that's for sure.
Trick question.
Give it just another minute here to let people have time to respond and think about their answers. Should be ready to show our results as soon as we get most people participating. There we go. Okay. Oh, I see a winner here among flexible and fast recovery to any location. In first place, more automation to restore back into production is neck and neck with instant access to an enable hosted VM. Site-to-site failover looks like the less important of these, although like you say, they're all important.
Yeah, really good feedback, because of course the site-to-site failover is important, but our findings were that it's more relevant sort of in this natural disaster. So if we believe that ransomware recovery is more sort of the thing that keeps us up at night mostly, the flexibility is going to go a long way, because you don't know where the sandbox might end up being, right? So the security persona says, hey, Stefan, I need you to restore this data, but please put it over here. And this is a true story. I mean, when the Maersk, when NotPetya happened, Maersk was running blind for like 2 days. It was crazy. And they were able to find a copy of the domain controller on a box in Angola, somewhere in Africa, because it was undergoing maintenance, so therefore it was offline. And so it's isolation work, and they were able to restore it. But the incident response team from Deloitte was in London, so they wanted it restored there into a sandbox so they could do their forensics and deem this copy as safe to restore back into production. So therefore, the flexibility can really help. And just, I thought it's an interesting, crazy story. You know, and they're very real. So thanks for that feedback. Okay, so then the question is, all right, that's great. Isolation can work, flexibility, but how do we, can we challenge our thinking a little bit? There is no right answer, by the way. I want to make that very clear. There's not like, this is the way to go, but we want to always challenge. Is there another way to do this? And the question is always, as we started off with backup and recovery and evolve over time, we see architectures typically, you know, using multiple copies, multiple replicas, right, in order to deliver on this ever-changing threat landscape. In other words, you have a copy over here in another data center for the natural disaster use case, and then you have something that's isolated, which is the third copy type thing. Maybe you run something off the tape, right? And so, and you're doing this really from a business continuity perspective. So the challenge really is, can cyber recovery or cyber resiliency still be done with less complexity? That's kind of the challenge we want to put in front of all of us collectively. And then maybe I think the next one is a slide I have to advance. Just a baseline. How many copies? What's your world look like if you're willing to share?
Yeah, this is us just asking you, what are you doing today? What have you currently got in place? Knowing that different scenarios call for different answers. And like Stefan said, there's not a right answer necessarily. We just are curious sort of, you know, where you stand today. How many copies are you keeping? Where are you putting them? Kind of what's the state of the union today at this moment? A couple folks have been asking the questions if the slide deck will be available, and yes, it will, as well as the recording of the session. So that's.
Can we make the polls available as well? The results, that might be interesting for folks as well.
Oh, that's a good point. I'm not sure. We'll have to figure that out.
We'll take that offline, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, it looks like there's a lot of different ways to go here, a lot of different options.
Oh.
So we'll give them just another minute. And this one you have to select one because, you know.
Oh, bummer. Yeah, okay. That probably makes it a bit harder, but it's fine.
That's right. Must decide, must choose. Okay, there we go. Oh, it looks like the majority of folks here are doing primary one on the network plus one tier to the cloud, which makes sense.
Kind of a local copy and a cloud-based copy of sorts. There's a difference between tiering, and I'll get to that a little bit, and just having another copy in the cloud. But I'm just going to make the assumption that it's latter, that we're going to have another copy in the cloud, so that way you have the benefit of two. So if I lose my local infrastructure, you know, I at least have the copy in the cloud to go to. Maybe some of you can confirm that hypothesis in the chat, but that's certainly something I'm thinking. But thanks, I mean, for your feedback. It's a consistent picture. Okay, so let's, you know, this is again not to take a knock on any vendor or infrastructure. This is just also something I've been seeing, and how we saw sort of the traditional data protection, business continuity topologies sort of sprawl, if that's the right way to look at it. So you got a source, that's your whatever, your data source that I'm backing up. And then typically what we have is we have a policy. And then maybe we'll just mark this up. It doesn't matter. Backup policy is really just, you know, what's the source, what's the target? That should be typically a storage array. It could be something like a purpose-built backup appliance. It could be a NAS, right? And then we go off and we run that policy defining, you know, how often, backup frequency, how long do I want to retain it? Great. Now, this local active tier, as you might want to refer to it, can come in two flavors. Either it's just a target appliance, so you're running your software separately on another server, or it can be an integrated appliance. Either way, it is reasonable to assume that you're going to have limited storage. Unless you have a scale-out appliance, you're going to have limited storage. Sizing is going to be critical, but eventually, if you want to get the benefit of long-term retention, you're going to have to run some of that data into the cloud, where it's arguably cheaper on a dollar per gig basis, but it just has the ability to just give you that infinite storage, so to speak. So this policy number 4 is very common in order to just, after how many days do I start running those or moving those backup copies into the cloud? So typically, I think it's reasonable to assume you have something like 45, maybe 60 days retention on your active tier, and then anything beyond that, you're going to move into the archive. Now, there's some sizing considerations, there is recovery time considerations, and let's face it, you do have to manage that as a policy attribute. Whether you do that in your primary dashboard is just another thing to think about. So in other words, to get the benefit of long-term retention, there's another policy attribute that I have to worry about because of the sort of storage limitations in that active tier. Now, we talked about natural disasters, so very often we would have another copy number 2. Now, by the way, this could be in the cloud, or this could be in another data center. It could be in a cloud service provider, so think private cloud. That's really not the point. The point is you're going to have another copy somehow, whether you replicate it or you run it off from the source directly, that will be governed by another policy, right? So that's policy number 2. The question we would ask ourselves, do I really need to replicate every copy, or do I replicate just only every once daily, but the inter-dailies I'm just going to keep on my active tier, right? So more things to think about. Policy number 2 will just talk about the replication cadence, right? But that is just a sort of a like-to-like replication. The problem with ransomware in this case is, of course, if the corruption happens on copy number 1, then automatically copy number 2 will be compromised. Let me repeat. If I manage to corrupt and encrypt copy number 1, most replication mechanisms, the way they work, they will have the copy on, or the copy on that DR copy corrupted as well. So what do? Well, then we have to have a policy that actually creates snaps, restore points that are ideally immutable or retention log, so that I can use those for purpose of recovery. So even if I destroy that latest copy, I can go back to some other copy. And then the vault copy is really just to kind of highlight that oftentimes we try to get the principles of isolation, some air gapping, and that policy will be different as well, because it's a different type of disaster that I'm solving for, with different policy attributes, including the creation and destruction of these immutable copies after a certain time period has passed, right? A certain retention period has passed. So the point is really that this is pretty complex, right? And it becomes a layered cake. The question is also, do I really need all these copies, up to 4, maybe 3, if you want to be maybe a little bit more, like, do I need 2 copies or 3? And then how do I actually apply patches to this entire infrastructure, especially when something is isolated, when it's in a vault, right? There's a lot of think time, a lot of design considerations, and certainly when I think now about recovering, the recovery runbook from a topology that looks like this is going to be pretty complicated, because you're going to have to go through some what if scenarios. What if I don't have the active tier? Can I get it out of the cloud archive? Well, I could, unless it's a copy that's shorter than 45 days. It's not going to help me, which sucks in a ransomware recovery scenario, right? What happens if I don't have my DR site? What if I don't have any of it? Like the whole production is shot. Can I get something out of the vault, right? So it just means that the DR, the recovery runbook that we need to practice ideally, is going to become increasingly complex by the number of policies that I need to think about, and of course by number of endpoints that I'm actually replicating or moving copies to, right? That's just a fact, which is, I think, why I also saw in the cyber recovery case the biggest impediment often was, how do I manage this? How do I patch this? I mean, I need like an army of people. It's very valuable. It's what I need to do. And in enterprise customer situations, that might work. But as we move down market, this model quickly starts to erode a little bit. And so the alternative approach could be, and it is again not the one solution that saves it all, but what if we could actually have a copy, the primary copy, that happens to be in the cloud by default? So immediately what I'm doing is I'm moving the copies off of the primary network of the data it's intended to protect. And by the way, I don't have to worry about long-term retention, because in the cloud, I do have infinite retention. It's up to you to set how long you want to keep the data, but you govern that in policy number 1. And then what if we then give you the ability to also have a local copy, whether that's a local speed vault, think of a NAS share, network share, or a a server, or something that is the latest copy that just sits there as a standby. So you get the benefit of those shorter RTOs, but the primary direction is cloud first, right? Get the benefit of the isolation, get it off the network, and then on-premise second, as opposed to on-premise first, and then let's bolt on the cloud, right? That's kind of the idea. That's what we like to challenge, of course, get your input on. But I think the benefits really are obvious, because you can actually see the picture. It will reduce the number of policies. It will therefore simplify your policy management. It's going to be less time sizing and planning this environment. The patching is going to be much easier because it's done for you, right? It's done by the cloud provider. So I don't have to worry about sort of several pieces of infrastructure that hopefully should all need to be at the latest patch level, because what good is a recovery architecture if it can be exploited, right? So fewer points, fewer things to deal with. And then of course, there's just the sheer benefit of cost containment. I don't have to worry about supply chain, sourcing, making an investment on $1 per gig perspective for a number of copies just to get the benefit of isolation and recovery in various what-if scenarios. And hopefully you can see this could also give you quite a bit of flexibility, right? Rather than jamming a specific appliance in one specific area on the network, being able to use different repurposed hardware in a sandbox, as an example, can also be a side benefit that's certainly worth highlighting. So what this would look like in a really silly, high-level design would be, okay, so you got a couple of attack vectors, right? We have the IT admin, Stefan, right? And then hopefully I'm not going to click on the wrong email, and well, if I do, somebody might harvest my credentials, right? So the question is, if somebody has my password to the backup infrastructure, they could do a lot of damage. So how do we mitigate against that? And I think the consensus is multi-factor authentication should just be almost like mandated. It should just be a default. If we don't have multi-factor authentication in backup products or just software in general, that's a real problem, and which is why the US federal government is considering not having MFA a category 1, so a critical vulnerability. Then, of course, we could go on the bottom left after the app server. So this is basically where I talked about, hey, this is your Active Directory. It's a Windows server, but we need to patch it. So this is a good plug for our patching solution that we have, which is really awesome, because it will show you possible exploits, but then it will also give you a path to patch it, because at the end of the day, that's just the lower level thing we can do. And it's a low-hanging fruit. Then, if I'm a bad actor, I can clearly go after the backup server, because if I can take out your backup catalog or backup register, right, then you're not going to be able to recover. So there goes it's going to be really difficult. There are ways to bring back the backup server if you made a copy of the bootstrap and so forth, but it's really, really painful and almost never automated. Definitely don't want to go there. And then, of course, the backup target, whether this is a NAS device, whether this is a server, clearly the attack vector is governed by how secure is my NFS or protocol, and then of course the box itself. So there's just another server or device that needs to be patched. Yeah, there are of course sample remediations we can take for that as well. But I think the benefit of moving to an in cloud or cloud first solution like Cove is that you can actually remove that threat vector from your network, right? And move it into a secured cloud that is managed by Enable, secured by Enable. So it is a lot harder. It's nothing is ever impossible, but it's a lot harder for if I, as the bad actor, exploit the IT admin's vulnerability and credential harvesting. It's a lot harder to hack my way into the SaaS control plane of the SaaS provider, right? That's basically the thing we want to think about. So what are the benefits? Well, my backup infrastructure is no longer on the network. It's actually tucked away in the secure data center, and my backup target is also tucked away. I talked about endless or unlimited retention. And then the other benefit is you don't have to do any vendor coordination in order to keep this infrastructure up to the latest patch level. We do that. So not only is it going to save you time, but it's probably going to reduce the turnaround time of keeping your patch levels up, right? Then, of course, the question is, well, I still got Stefan here, the IT admin, and then clearly supporting MFA is maybe overstating it that we're going to make these threat vectors go away, but the illustration is it's going to mitigate, reduce the attack surface, and MFA will go a long way, right? So that's what the picture could look like. Now the question is, well, hey, wait a minute, what happened to my local backup? Well, I talked about one use case, which is the local speed vault. It's not demonstrated or illustrated here, but that could just be another server. Or what I could do is I could run a proactive, scheduled, continuous restore of my VMs of choice, put it on a standby image or put it on an infrastructure that you own, whether that's a server or whether that's a NAS device. And that way you have it ready either in a mounted or a raw V8 flat VHDX format to accelerate your recovery when you need it. Benefit is you can repurpose your hardware. You have a great degree of flexibility where you want this location to be. And actually it does mitigate against the one drawback, which is if I had to pull it back from the cloud, arguably the recovery is going to be slower. Recovery time is going to be slower than if I already had the copy ready on the on-premise device. So it's basically turning our paradigm a little bit upside down, back it up, put it in the cloud first, reduce the attack vector, but then using the restore, the proactive continuous restore workflow to have your copy ready on-premise. So it's just the other way around than we usually do it, and we're seeing a lot of success and interest, obviously, in this approach. Okay, so now we're going to shift gears a little bit. I did want to talk a little bit about what's Cove data protection. It's definitely a product that actually deserves more visibility and more awareness. Appliance free, like I talked about, it basically does the data move from your source directly into the Enable cloud. And what we protect is not a boil the ocean, all the workloads under the sun, but something that's germane to the SMB space, right? So virtual physical servers, workstations, desktop, laptop, and M365, which is our primary growth drivers. We do support other workloads as well, but this is kind of the ideal mix for your modern hybrid worker. So the benefit is you have one SaaS control plane, multi-tenant, with active management that does it all, versus having different products, different user interfaces to cover this workload mix, right? That's clearly important. It's delivered as a service. We'll talk about that. We can honor data sovereignty, right? So we have data centers in your location, and it's really designed for the MSP. So when you think about sort of the skills shortage, it's ideal because all the tools and the way it's designed is really for someone running it as a managed service versus running it as an IT admin necessarily. Nice customer mix, 12,000 MSP plus. We crossed 1 million Microsoft users protected a while ago, and we have about 150 petabytes backed up, but that's actually a pretty small number when you compare it to the front end terabyte equivalent, and we'll cover a little bit why that is. Now, I'm not going to drain this. I talked about some of the benefits, but you know what's keeping us up at night and why the Cove architecture lends itself to sort of what's going on in the industry is quite simple. First of all, customers are moving to the cloud. So, I mean, you just have to look at the adoption of SaaS services, the adoption of M365, and then contrast this to the trend trajectory on Exchange as an example. But of course, cyber incidents, we talked about this, and IT skills shortage. That's the mix that there are many other things, but that's kind of the mix that keeps us up at night. And as service providers or end users, equivalently, those are the things we tend to design our initiatives around. So having a cloud first and appliance-free data protection solutions can really help, because think about the logic. We know that the workloads that we are trying to protect are moving to the cloud. Why would the backup application be any different than any other application? So why wouldn't it also be in the cloud? That doesn't even make sense, right? So it's a logical progression of what we see in the industry anyway. And then it has a lot of benefits, which is, well, I talked about patching. You don't have to do maintenance. You don't have to do procurement. You don't have to do sizing. You don't have to do storage expansions or non-disruptive upgrades or disruptive upgrades if you don't have a scale-out appliance. All this goes away, and it's done by the vendor, which in turn frees up time, which helps in the skills shortage, right? If I can basically take that work off of your plate and you can focus on the outcome and the reporting and then work on some other strategic initiatives, that's a good thing. And now MSPs can become more profitable. And then of course, having a single control plane helps, single pane of glass, where I can do everything. Now, a junior IT admin can actually do the job that previously maybe 4 or 5 people needed to do, right? So that's kind of the narrative. There's a little bit of an evolution, but I'm not going to drain this. You can kind of, there's a nice report out there, but ultimately the backup evolution or the backup landscape has evolved. And I think just in terms of growth rates, right, because a lot of this already covered, we see sort of in this standalone software, standalone target appliance about flat to declining. Some companies do quite well, but it typically never crosses like 9% CAGR, okay? Integrated appliances do better because they make it easier to administer. So whether it's a scale-out appliance, which is more of an enterprise thing, or a scale-up appliance, we tend to see, according to IDC, 2 to 3% growth. But direct to cloud, data protection as a service is growing at 16 to 20%. And within that segment, the disaster recovery as a service is growing the fastest at over 20% CAGR. And that's for a reason. And it's really aligned with all those benefits that it promises to deliver in light of the industry tailwinds that we just explored, right? So that's the reason why. So we're positioned, I think, in the right place architecturally. And obviously, we're not the only ones doing this. But I just kind of left off some of the other ones, but various others are in this space and doing this quite successfully. So it's an industry growth. Now let's talk a little bit about sort of what it looks like, high-level architecture. So we talked about server, desktop, laptop, M365. The data gets moved from your target or from your source to the target. It ends up in our cloud. It's SOC compliant. It's protected and managed and patched by our personnel, so it's something you don't have to worry about it. And of course, you get the benefit that your copies are now off your network and sort of off that attack surface. Now, when you think about sort of the plethora of restore options, there's a couple of things we do. We do recovery testing. You can think of this as, give me an integrity check on would my VM boot? So it's more of a background check. It's probably more for compliance and audit. It's not an actual restore, but it's a mini DR drill that does not replace a tabletop or a full DR drill, but it gives you some level of confidence that it would work when you have to do it. The standby image is actually the actual restore, but it will be done proactively on a scheduled basis. So you would basically schedule, you add it to a plan, and then the copy, the latest copy of your VM, VHDX will end up on one of these pieces of infrastructure. And as you can see, we're already in market with NAS or shared storage or network share and local Hyper-V server. But what we're really excited about is that we're embarking on having the Azure instance be a target for a restore, which is quite exciting. And a lot of our customers are quite interested about that. You'll learn more. And we're planning to do an external preview, hopefully, by the end of the year. Now, this is great, but it doesn't work without the right architecture. And what I mean by that is it's all about the data movement. Protecting desktop laptops is really difficult unless you're super efficient. There are very few products in the market that can do this well, but definitely Enable Backup is one of them. And the reason, I'll explain this in the next slide, but I wanted to kind of tease out why or what the benefit would be or what the outcome would be. But if you look at sort of just a sample 1 terabyte computer size, whether that's a server, it doesn't matter, right? Oftentimes with image-based backup solutions, the change rate is quite high. I'll explain a little bit on the next slide why that is, but an average, and we did a bunch of testing, 6%. So you can kind of see how that quickly then adds up to an incremental gigabyte. And then you have to factor in how often do I take the copy, and you can do the math. How much data am I moving over the wire? With us, it's much smaller, right? It's much smaller, and then therefore we can actually afford to move much less data over the wire. What's the benefit of that? It's quite simple. Scenario number one, I have a hotel chain, and they don't have they're in the Caribbean, maybe they don't have the best internet connection, or whatever the scenario might be. I can still make a daily backup possible, right? And move the data from the source into the Enable cloud. Or I can just, I have good bandwidth, but I can take a backup much more often. I can do it every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes, right? So the backup frequency will increase. And then of course the restore time should also increase. Anytime I move less data, then the benefits would be on the backup and the restore flow. How do we do it? Real quick. We have this thing called True Delta, and it starts off by just backing up less, right? So with image, we have a lot of data that by default, you really don't need to back up. Temporary, transient data, browser caches, your virus definitions. The list goes on. Microsoft has a list because we actually back up in guest versus at the disk level. We can provide very good and very granular filtering options, both out of the box, but also with a high degree of customization. So now your backup corpus has already been reduced, which helps with everything downstream. Now we also process the backup jobs more efficiently. This is just time saved in this overall end-to-end backup process. But as you can imagine, with image-based backups, I need to look at the blocks, how they have changed. So I move a file from one folder to the other, or I do a defragmentation. The block layout on the drives will have changed. I need to understand that, I need to process that, and that will take time to find those segments that change, so then I know what I need to move, what I don't need to move. Because we're at the file or the content level, we don't have to scan that. We don't have to operate. We know whether a file is the same or not. And whether it moved or not is completely irrelevant, or whether there's a defrag on the drive letter is also completely irrelevant. So less time spent scanning. And then lastly, we can actually move less data, right? So whereas with image-based solutions, I do have to move those change blocks, unfortunately. Right, we actually with Enable really only worry about the segments within the file that actually have changed. So we first of all know which ones have changed, which files, and then we only move small blocks for that, and that gives us that high degree of sort of granularity. Now that's a bit technical, I know, but the benefits are important because direct to cloud backup for the workloads we support is really, really hard. So it's one thing to say I have an architectural advantage, but if your backup windows suck, then it doesn't really matter. But they don't suck. They are actually great, and you can still get the benefits of this architectural advantage, and that's what makes me so excited about Cove. Now, what I thought we could do is, I believe this is the last slide, do a quick demo, but and then we'll have a last poll. But do you want to do the poll first, Carrie?
Before we do that, yeah, let's do the last poll. Tracy, if you could bring the last polling question up on the screen, that would be great. And we also do have a few questions that have come in through chat. So give folks a minute to give us their thoughts on this one. You notice we give you 3 chances to say yes and 1 chance to say no. But we hope that you're intrigued enough that you definitely want to learn more, and there's lots of different ways to do it. We can get you on a call with one of our technical experts. You can get pricing information, of course, from us, and you can start a free 30-day trial if you want to try it for yourself. And because Cove is a SaaS application, the nice thing is there's nothing to download and install. You don't need to, provision local storage. You can literally start a trial and have your first backup starting in just a few minutes. So that's another option. And while people are answering that, Stefan, let me just mention a couple of the questions that we've gotten through the chat window. One of them says a lot of our clients ask for the 3-2-1 backup schema, and they ask about things like air-gapped offline backups. I think you've already talked a little bit about this, but is there anything else you would add to how Cove meets those requirements?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. That's kind of gets into that architecture that I painted. And I think the other one you would throw in is immutability. Now, a lot of these concepts, and that was my experience certainly, are in place because the copies are already not isolated enough, right? So what do? Well, first you got to replicate, create another one, and then the question is, how do I secure those copies because they're still on the network? So immutability is a useful feature, right? And then ideally, how do I air gap, which is typically a logical if config, right, that I do on that replication link. So this is a design that I can simplify. That's the part I talked about. When I move data directly in the cloud, I would argue that you already have sufficient isolation. Could we implement an air gap? Absolutely. We can talk about this. But the question is really, is it really a design we need to be focused on, knowing that you're already moving the data and you remove the data off of the network, and it's a secure link and it's hardened, and of course there's a trust that we establish to avoid sort of a man-in-the-middle attack scenario. Is that a good enough design? I believe it is, and it's actually better than something that's air-gapped but still on the network, right? So those are trade-offs, but I would argue that we are solving that isolation, not air-gap, but isolation piece more elegantly. We have one less thing to coordinate, which is sort of that link management, and we get equal or better isolation, right? Just by removing it out of the reach of someone who's on the quote unquote network. The immutable one is a good one, right? It helps, but again, that's also because we had some dire situations in the market where people just deleted the storage and everything along with it. So along came, let's just retention lock them or worm lock them, and there's some products, some of which I was very familiar with, that have high degrees of retention lock. But often what happened is that the attackers, because they had access to the network, just executed lower level attacks and just did sort of a disk reconfiguration job. And so anyway, found ways to destroy the data. It's a lot harder to do that. But my point is the retention lock thing and the immutability thing is particularly useful when your appliance is on premise, on the same network as the data you're protecting. It's less, I think it's less critical if your backup infrastructure and the copies are off the network to begin with.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, hopefully.
I'm sorry, one more quick question, and then, yeah, let's go ahead and move on to the demo. So someone is asking, and this is actually a really interesting question, what if a Cove employee is compromised? What steps have we put in place to minimize the ability for the bad actor to do any damage to our customers' backups if they get, compromised to an employee?
Social engineering, that's a fabulous point. So first of all, of course, we have the multi-factor authentication, but if the person has bad intentions, that's a problem. This will be a problem regardless. The best answer I can give there is that that's really a process thing. Least privilege. We want to make sure that we are very careful with the amount of privileges. So, for example, we don't need 2,000 security officers, right? We need a handful. Now, I mean, there's always a scenario of one of those people are corrupted. What do you do? But this is just the world we live in. This is what what we have to deal with. But I think if we can apply least privilege, secure the credentials and the authentication, then even if that disgruntled employee starts deleting devices or backups, the people with the higher privileges will be able to peel that back. And that's what we're able to do. So there's always a recovery path, but those are clearly mitigation steps, right? It's like what is it called? Multiple lines of defense, if you will. But that's how we do it. And I think that's how other companies do it and should consider it. So again, this is also where it's not just all technology, it's also process. And really ratcheting down who has privileges, who has API access is critically important.
Good. Okay, we've got some people really diving deep into the questions here, which is great. One question is, since we're backing up changes to files, how do you know if the file being changed is a good change and not a bad actor making a change to it? I know specifically on 365, we have some great stuff in place.
Yeah. No, that's fair. So first of all, if data is corrupted, whether you're the best storage system or the best backup solution, and I don't care what vendor, you're going to back that data up, right? So it's always, that's our job. We got to commit to disk the ones and zeros, whether they're encrypted, benign encryption, good encryption, what have you. We're going to destage. Now, the good thing is it's going to be in a dormant, a raw, tarball type format, so it's not just going to like magically rehydrate and destroy all the backups. But what the question really then begs is, how do we find anomalies? So with M365, when I started doing the trial, I got my own environment, and there was one SharePoint instance that had some malicious files, and they weren't backed up. So in other words, if there is source side scanning, AV, what have you, that finds anomalies and finds sort of corruption, we don't even back it up, which is nice. That's a really nice feature I didn't even know that we had. The other part, of course, needs to be where do we find anomalies? Maybe we look at the metadata, rates of change. That is actually an active part of our development roadmap to look at, what can we do to at least show you some anomalies? Because even with indexing, even with metadata level indexing, even full content level indexing, you're not going to be for sure able to say, well, this is corrupt, or this is a bad actor that made these changes. But you can at least find anomalies, right? File type mismatch. Hey, you know what? This is a Word document. I looked inside. Why does it have a PDF ending? Or, entropy scores and so forth. So there's ways to design it. But I would categorize that part as more basic, but that's something we're looking at right now. So that's how you would tell.
Great, good stuff. Thank you. I keep saying one last question and then more keep coming in. Someone is asking, if my backup portal gets compromised and someone deletes my backup jobs, which in turn will probably delete the backup instances in the data center, can Cove still recover them for us?
Yes, the answer is yes, we can. We have like this, I want to call it a high level answer, like this recycle bin type contact. So you would then open a support ticket, and then we would peel back the data, but of course that would suck. So that's why the security hygiene is of course super important. These privileges, we talked about that, be very conservative with your super users and of course security officers. But the answer is yes, you can then, even in that super GAU type scenario, peel back the data and recover.
That's
but it
great
would.
news. All right, so we're at the top of the hour, but we did want to give a little quick demo for those who are interested and want to stay for it. The other thing I would mention is in the chat window, you can see a link. Our annual partner event is coming up very soon called Empower. And I'd encourage you to follow that link, take a look at it, see if you might be interested in attending. In the meantime, let's jump into the demo.
Cool. All right, and I promise, guys, it's not going to take very long. Just wanted to show you. So this is what you would look at. You would, go into Cove. It gives you sort of a multi-tenant view. You have the ability to add customers, right? And the customers can go deep. You can have by organization and so forth. So nice sort of consolidated view. And then immediately you would sort of see what's going on in your overall population. So you can see we have a bunch of servers, workstations, documents, and then we did parse out sort of the M365 domains, and then how many users, and then you can kind of see your backup success rate, right? So that's pretty cool. And then when you go to one of these, what it actually shows you is a rolling last 28 days, success rate. If it's green, that's generally good, and all these columns are customizable, you can export it, and so forth. So it gives you sort of an immediate, very useful view. What I thought we could do is we could just go in one of these, and hopefully it's not going to noodle forever here. Live demos can always be tricky, but I'm going to pull up the. Go ahead.
While it's loading, there was a question I overlooked, and I'm sorry about that. We were talking up front about different types of attacks and the statistics about how often and what kind, and someone did ask if we had any statistics or information on domain versus workgroup attacks.
Let me take that as an action. And if you could get the name, and maybe we could even feed it back to the group, but probably our CISO has some good statistics on that.
Great.
I don't have them off the top of my head.
Got it. Thank you.
It's a great question. It's a great question, because that would dictate what workloads should I be protecting, right? So here we have a server backup. The device happens to be a server. And I just wanted to kind of like look at the history here. So we because we're in guest, right, backup, if you want to do an image level restore, you essentially need the appropriate files and folders and the system state, and then that gives you the ability to do an image-based recovery without having to do an image-based backup. But when you look at sort of the selected size, you can kind of add it up, and you're looking at a 50-ish, 50 gig probably machine, not huge. And then when you see it's sort of like how many files were processed, but mostly what's been transferred, that's pretty awesome, right? That's a minimal amount of data. And then when you look at sort of how long did it take to back up, right? We're talking about a 2-minute backup window, right? And so that's nice. So it can be larger. Of course, larger servers will carry larger backup windows. But the point is just to see how efficient the system is. It's pretty astounding, right? So again, in this use case where you're doing an edge to core backup and you're way out there, bandwidth constrained, with this type of solution, you can still back up daily. But clearly, as you can see here, you can do inter-daily backups, which is nice. Was one thing I wanted to just highlight. Bunch of statistics. And then when you look at sort of the recovery dashboard, this is that standby image piece that I talked about. What would happen is, first of all, you get the dashboard. You can kind of see how many devices were recovered, what's your success rate, similar idea. We only worry about the last 14 recoveries. And by the way, we do also boot, right? If it's at least mounted. I mean, if it's a local flat file, we don't, because that's what you specified. But as long as you sort of mount it, we can boot it, give you the screenshot, and then keep it ready. So, what I might show here is, first of all, what you would go and do is you would add a storage recovery location. So this is where you can then roll in and say, yep, I got a server, and then you would download it, and I would be doing this now from my machine, and then download. It's a silent install. And then we'll end up on this list, right? So we'll have one of these machines. You can use the free Windows 2019 version as an example. You can see how much storage is available, some nice statistics. And once you have the recovery location mapped or created, I can basically go in and add a device to a plan. I mean, so I have to decide, do I do the recovery testing, which is essentially the recovery, the mini DR drill that I talked about, can happen every 2 weeks or every month, or do I actually do the proactive continuous restore, put it in on that recovery location that I just created? So I'm just going to go into that because the workflows look quite similar. You know, you would select the recovery location. If I haven't, I can still do it. Grab one, move through. It will flag which devices are compatible versus not. I can just, whatever, pick one. I don't know what I'm, just pick one for just random access. It detected the passphrase. I can go next. Decide whether I want a restore format to be in a Hyper-V or local flat VHDX file. And then I can actually specify an email report. So that's the other nice thing. We have a lot of email reporting capabilities. And then basically go ahead and assign a plan. I just don't want to put my email in right now because I'm lazy, but you get the idea, right? So this will basically produce a plan. And once it's on the plan, it will show up here and it will show you the progress. I just wanted to show one of them here. If you can see the screenshot, I hope it works. But it would basically show me the boot status. Yep, it worked, great. And it normally would show me some, I'm having a hard time moving these around, but it will give me actually a full audit log because it's currently running, right? But I mean, in the history, I can see a full audit log of what booted, what services turned on, and so forth. So you get the idea. So that's pretty much it. There's much more to unpack here. Just wanted to give you a quick sort of teaser in terms of the, you know, what this product looks like, what it can do. A lot of great stuff to unpack, but you know, I think we can also pick that off, and if you're interested in more in a sort of a private session. So with that, I think we're done.
I think we are. We went a little over time, but that's great. And thank you, Stefan, and thank you to all of our attendees. We will be definitely sending out a recording of this session for your future reference. And if you want to share it with other colleagues, you will have it. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.